One morning in June, a celebration was unfolding in downtown Bridgeport. There was a brass band. People were holding political signs. There was a feeling of momentum in the air.
The people have the power! The people have the...
A group called Bridgeport Generation Now Votes was about to make a big announcement.
All right.
Members want to change politics in the city. They also want Mayor Joe Ganim out of the picture.
Yes, we can. Ready? This year is a year when we will end corruption at City Hall. Yes, we can!
And so they held this big event, and they got behind one of Ganim's opponents.
It doesn't matter how many people you threaten, right? It matters that we live here, we care about Bridgeport.
That's Marilyn Moore. She's a Democrat, and she already has a significant role in public life. Moore represents Bridgeport in the state senate. And on that morning back in June, she was campaigning to be mayor.
And we're going to fight and take down that door, and we're going to walk in there. And it won't be just Marilyn Moore walking in there. It'll be all of you going with me and standing with me to say this place belongs to all of us. This is our home.
There have been calls for reform in Bridgeport before, and efforts to unseat the political establishment, but they haven't taken hold.
And after all that fanfare with the band and everything, Marilyn Moore wasn't elected mayor. She didn't get enough signatures to make the ballot.
Local Democrats endorsed Ganim to stay in office. The longtime mayor who went to prison for corruption, got out, returned to politics, and was now running for re-election.
No surprise.
Moore spoke with us by phone right after she lost the mayoral endorsement. She said the political establishment in Bridgeport is formidable.
It is the town chair's duty to keep things going the way they are with no progress. And he did that by making sure his members nominated Joe Ganim again.
From Connecticut Public, I'm Kate Seltzer.
And I'm Bria Lloyd.
This is In Absentia, a podcast about political dysfunction in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
The systems that enable it.
And what this all means for the residents who wonder if their vote even matters.
Earlier in the series, we highlighted some of Bridgeport's lasting challenges. We talked about the mayor's criminal conviction and his return to politics.
And we explored the Democratic Town Committee's role in shaping elections.
The explosive video that upended the 2023 mayoral election.
And the allegations that people inside the city's political establishment improperly swayed votes.
For some Bridgeport residents, those problems feel so deeply ingrained that it's hard to get people to take them seriously. Here's former state representative Jack Hennessy.
This is not really a political issue. This is a civil rights issue in which the voices of the people of Bridgeport have been suppressed for decades. Now we finally have proof with the video coverage in which this no longer can be swept under the rug and denied and joked about up in Hartford.
On this final episode, we ask, how does Connecticut hold people in power accountable?
We'll look at one group trying to create an alternative vision for politics in Bridgeport.
There should be no confusion anymore about whether Bridgeport's local democracy has a problem. We most definitely do.
We'll also examine the systems in place to investigate and prosecute corruption cases in Connecticut, like the one that sent Ganim to prison 20 years ago.
You don't have state prosecutors who have the tools that they need to start enforcing these state statutes. You've got a bit of a gap in enforcement.
And we'll dive into local elections, how they work, and how Connecticut can improve them.
I think most people inside the city know that there's a problem and kind of just shake their head at the system.
Kate takes it from here.
In Bridgeport, there's a growing movement of grassroots activism focused on increasing civic engagement. And one force in that arena is Bridgeport Generation Now. Callie Gale Heilman is one of the founders. She moved to Bridgeport in 2013.
Started hanging out with people and meeting new people and went through 2 election cycles. Very quickly started to feel that something was wrong here. For example, when we first started meeting, people kept saying, It's the absentee ballots. The problem is the absentee ballots.
Absentee ballots played a major role in Bridgeport's last 2 elections for mayor. And both times, they sparked a huge amount of controversy. Political operatives were accused of illegally handling other people's absentee ballots.
When you talk to Bridgeport residents, we all say, why does this happen here? Or when I go to other places, it's not like this. The problem of having a broken democracy is not a conspiracy theory, right? It's real, and people know it and they can articulate it.
Bridgeport Generation Now has been growing its reach for the past 8 years. Organizers say it's a positive movement for change. But the group is also very critical of GANM, and its leaders say they haven't received a warm embrace from the city, including during Bridgeport's search for a permanent police chief in 2018.
If the city is going to engage in a national police chief search, then the community must be involved in that search.
Jameen Davis is co-director for Bridgeport Generation Now. We should note that Davis was previously the campaign manager for Marilyn Moore, who you heard from at the beginning of this episode. Moore is the one who tried unsuccessfully to beat Joe GANM. Looking back on the police chief hiring process, Davis says she believes citizens didn't have a meaningful opportunity to participate.
We were not asking for things that were out of the ordinary in any way. We were saying we should have a forum with the police chief finalist. We should know who the committee is that is going to make the recommendation to the mayor.
Armando Perez was acting police chief at the time. He was known to be one of GANM's allies. He was actually GANM's driver when he was mayor back in the 90s. Perez ultimately got the job of top cop, but he was forced to resign just a few years later.
Some developing news out of Bridgeport tonight. That city's police chief is off the job and under arrest.
Police Chief Armando Perez has resigned after federal authorities say he and another top city official actually rigged the application process that got him that chief job.
Perez did time in federal prison for coordinating with Bridgeport's personnel director to ensure he became police chief. GANM wasn't personally accused of any wrongdoing. He told the Associated Press at the time that he did everything according to the city charter. GANM said he didn't have contact with anybody involved in the hiring process until he was forwarded a list of 3 finalists. But the hiring scandal was a black mark for his administration.
When GANM chose Armando, it was about taking care of his friend. And taking care of his friend meant that our police department was then thrown into chaos.
More recently, Bridgeport Generation Now has been focused on clean elections. It launched an affiliated nonprofit, Bridgeport Generation Now Votes, which gets more directly involved in electoral politics. That group funded a lawsuit challenging the outcome of the 2019 primary. They wanted to know if political campaigns violated Connecticut's election laws by doing things like collecting absentee ballots from people or coercing them into voting for a specific candidate. They worked with a tenants organization to speak directly with a bunch of voters, particularly residents in low-income and senior housing. We talked about this lawsuit in the last episode. Judge Barry Stevens, who heard the case, didn't overturn the primary, but he didn't like what he saw.
In summary, the plaintiffs were successful in identifying very serious election law violations.
Stevens said the legislature should give state voting rules another look. Here's Heilman from Bridgeport Gen Now again.
While that trial in 2019 did not result in the overturning of that election, those election results, the evidence was entered into the record for everyone to see. So there should be no confusion anymore about whether Bridgeport's local democracy has a problem. We most definitely do.
Generation Now Votes is part of a coalition that released its own platform for the city. It calls for zero tolerance for political patronage and cronyism, and more training for voters, campaigns, and election workers. Generation Now Votes also made a big push of its own during the 2023 mayoral race to make absentee ballot applications more widely available. Now, that might sound surprising. After all, a lot of the concern in Bridgeport is about potential absentee ballot misconduct. But Bridgeport Generation Now Votes says the problem isn't absentee voting. It's political operatives getting involved and steering people's votes. So before the election, the group took out thousands of ballot applications to mail directly to voters. They also campaigned successfully for the state to install an election monitor to watch over things in the city.
The election monitor was our attempt to get some state intervention, but it requires that we build enough power, grassroots power, to overcome that abuse.
Bridgeport's reputation has been shaped by Mayor Joe Ganim. His rise, his downfall, and his comeback. And so corruption is bound up in public perceptions of the city. Remember, Ganim went to prison for taking kickbacks. And in some ways, the city had to rebuild its own reputation just like he did. John Fabrizi was serving as president of the city council when Ganim was convicted, so he got the mayor's job. And over the next few years, Fabrizi says it was hard to get developers to look past the corruption scandal. He says Ganim's crimes set the city back.
It was bad. It was really bad. If there was a cloud over this city, that was dark. I mean, it was dark.
Now, many things we've talked about on this podcast aren't crimes. Like hiring people who worked on your campaign for city jobs, that isn't illegal. But real criminal conduct is also part of Bridgeport's history. We wanted to understand more about Ganim's case and how one like his might be handled today. So we talked to Willie Dow.
I'm a lawyer in New Haven. I've practiced in New Haven since 1974. Most of my courtroom work involves representing people accused of crime.
Dow is kind of a local legend. His clients include the state's former Republican governor, John Rowland. He defended Rowland against corruption charges in the early 2000s. Dow says the federal government has historically taken the lead on investigating public officials in Connecticut, like Ganim. He says federal prosecutors have more experience with corruption cases and more tools at their disposal.
The state has not been aggressive in pursuing major corruption cases, but there's a reason for it. It's in part historical and in part very practical.
In the federal system, there's a well-established process to facilitate investigations, the grand jury. And there's nothing exactly like it under state law in Connecticut. So when it comes to investigating corruption, Dow says that's typically directed by the feds.
It's like if you had a house and somebody was breaking in and you had a pea shooter and your neighbor had a gun. So you'd call the neighbors, hey, come on over, this guy's breaking into my house. We have to stop him from coming in. And the gun would be the Fed.
But what is the federal grand jury? It has a fancy title, but it's really a group of everyday citizens. They serve on multiple cases and decide if there's enough evidence to charge someone with a crime. And once a case is before the grand jury, the government can take pretty heavy-duty measures to gather evidence. Things like seizing bank records and tapping phones.
Hello. Hey, how you doing? Hey, Len, how you doing? All right.
Remember, Mayor Ganim was indicted by a grand jury back in the early 2000s. They heard FBI wiretaps from people around the corruption scandal that sent Ganim to prison.
Hello? Hey, Al, how are you? Good, who's this? Joe Ganim, how you been? Hey, Joe, how are you?
Getting that kind of investigative power, like to tap somebody's phone, that's more complicated here in Connecticut. The state has something called an investigatory grand jury. It's actually judges who can investigate criminal activity. On paper, it's a useful tool. But lawyer Willie Dow says it's also pretty cumbersome. That's because in state courts, there isn't a grand jury hanging around all the time.
It's not like there's a guy sitting on a bench in Hartford and say, oh, you, Mr. Grand Jury, come on, let's go. You're working this week, or you're going to go full time to this. No.
And so state grand juries just don't happen all that often. Records we reviewed show in Connecticut, prosecutors typically only call one together once or twice a year.
Prosecutors, as I say, are used to trying cases, not investigating cases. They're really not, and then this is not a knock on them, they're just not oriented that way.
What we're trying to understand here is whether Connecticut has learned any lessons on public corruption in the last 20 years. If what happened with Ganim and Rowland in the early 2000s were to happen again, is the state ready to act? This question is important because federal agencies almost always take the lead on tackling corruption in Connecticut. But these days, the bar might be higher for them to prove corruption charges in federal court. And that's because of a legal case a little further down I-95.
At the U.S. Supreme Court today, justices appeared to be ready to throw out the conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell on corruption charges. It's a step that federal prosecutors have warned could cripple their ability to bring crooked politicians to justice.
In 2016, the court overturned former Republican Governor McDonnell's conviction on corruption charges. A jury found him guilty of taking money and gifts from a local businessman while he was in office. McDonnell arranged meetings with state officials on his behalf. But the court found he didn't do anything substantial enough to meet the definition of bribery under federal law.
The Supreme Court said it needed to be something that was an official act, like an actual sort of decision on a matter, something that was sort of concrete.
Amy Ely is First Assistant Attorney General in Oklahoma. She specializes in white-collar crime. She says the court offered some clear guidance on what constitutes an official act in the federal system. And in a way, it narrowed that definition. The court said setting up a meeting, talking to another public official, organizing an event, those kinds of actions don't necessarily cross the line on their own. Politicians do those things for constituents all the time. And Ely says other recent court cases have had a similar effect.
Everything is sort of trending in the same direction, and that is to curtail the reach of federal statutes, to curtail the powers of federal prosecutors.
Ely says that could shift some of the burden back onto states.
If you don't have state prosecutors who have the tools that they need to start enforcing these state statutes, you've got a bit of a gap in enforcement.
In the past, some of Connecticut's top prosecutors have argued they don't have all the tools they need. They've called for expanding their own powers to gather evidence. Patrick Griffin is the current chief state's attorney. He says his office is capable of handling corruption cases like this.
I do think that we have the tools necessary.
Griffin says there are other reasons why the feds typically initiate corruption cases in Connecticut. For one, he says state's attorneys here already have a huge workload.
You know, prosecutors in Connecticut, by and large, are reactive, and that's because we are tasked with the investigation and prosecution of everything in Connecticut, from speeding tickets to murders.
Griffin also pushes back against the suggestion that Connecticut prosecutors defer to federal law enforcement, that state prosecutors abdicate their responsibility.
This is not a situation, generally speaking, where the feds just come in and elbow us out of the way.
He says his office coordinates closely with counterparts in the federal system. He says sometimes it just makes more sense for them to lead based on the nature of the crime.
There is generally at high-level interactions to determine really where is the best bang for the buck. Jurisdictional squabbles only benefit the bad guys. They don't benefit the public.
Another part of Bridgeport's story is the controversy around elections. Remember that video of someone stuffing a ballot box? Well, it's been driving a lot of discussion about voting rules in Connecticut.
Someone texted it to me, and I think like everybody else, my mouth dropped open.
That's Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas. She's talking about the first time she saw that ballot box video from Bridgeport.
I thought two things simultaneously. One, I can't believe it. And two, I'm glad there's proof.
What she's referring to is Bridgeport's long history of voting irregularities. There have been numerous cases of proven misconduct in the past. And many everyday people we talked to said they think local elections in Bridgeport aren't fair, that political operatives are breaking the rules. As Secretary of the State, Thomas doesn't enforce those rules. She can't send someone to prison. But her office does oversee the election process. Thomas says part of the challenge is most of us don't really know what the rules are. She's pushing for more public education.
People tend to rely almost on this oral history type of process. So what it tells me is that someone was doing what people have alleged they have done over time, and they just weren't thinking about it, because if it wasn't so normal and accepted, you wouldn't do it on camera. So it just made me think that a lot of the stories that have been alleged over the years just might have created a culture that people haven't broken out of.
There's actually been a lot going on with Connecticut's election laws over the last few years. For a long time, the state was more strict about who can vote by absentee ballot than a lot of other places. Lawmakers wanted to make it easier during the COVID-19 pandemic, so they loosened those rules. There's now a lot of debate in the state capitol about whether Connecticut should continue to expand access to voting this way. Currently, voters need to apply for an absentee ballot, and to be eligible, they need to have a valid reason why they can't make it to the polls on Election Day.
One way that other states have found cut down on even the possibility of absentee ballot malfeasance is for the county or the state to be the one to mail out applications.
Thomas supports universal access to absentee ballots, meaning every voter would be eligible to get one. She says it would cut down on campaigns spreading the wrong information.
So that's one way you can do it, and that would cut down on some of, what we're hearing in Bridgeport.
Thomas says Connecticut should also print barcodes on absentee ballot applications so it's easier to track them. And she says outdoor ballot drop boxes should be under video surveillance, the way the ballot boxes were in Bridgeport last year. Another big change is early voting. A couple of years ago, Connecticut passed a ballot question to make early voting available.
Many people cannot make it to a polling place because of work schedule or caregiving or childcare schedules. Now, with the early voting period, more people hopefully will go vote in person.
Thomas says early voting should reduce reliance on absentee ballots. She says that will close a loophole that political operatives can exploit. And state-appointed election monitors are keeping an eye on things.
I do remind people, though, I live in the world of the real, and some of these allegations go back 2 and 3 decades, and a lot of people have been saying, have the monitors solve this situation in a month? Probably not, but we are slowly but surely trying to chip away at anything that comes to our attention so that we can help shift the culture.
Ben Proto is chairman of the Connecticut Republican Party. Proto says Connecticut has some of the fairest elections in the country, but he agrees the time has come for a culture shift in Bridgeport.
I think most people inside the city know that there's a problem. I think most people inside the city are just trying to make a living and take care of their kids and their families and kind of just shake their head at the system.
Proto says one safeguard Connecticut should adopt is signature verification, making sure that the signature on an absentee ballot matches the one on file for each voter. He also says Connecticut towns should remove physical drop boxes, which he says would help eliminate opportunities for mishandling ballots.
We all have our own absentee ballot drop box in our house. It's called a mailbox. Put a stamp on it, you put it in your mailbox. Mailman will take it and deliver it. So I think the absentee ballot boxes have given rise to greater issues and potential fraud, like we saw in the videos.
Proto also believes there should be stiffer penalties for people convicted of election misconduct. And he says that would mean getting Democratic leaders in Connecticut to take voting problems more seriously.
There has to be the political will to look at your own party and say, we're not going to do this anymore.
Connecticut is a blue state. Joe Ganim is a Democrat. And Democrats control the levers of power in state government.
But when there are violations, I think those people should be held accountable.
Nancy DiNardo chairs the Connecticut Democratic Party. Part of her job is to help Democratic candidates get elected. And when it comes to elections in Bridgeport, DiNardo says the state should stay involved by keeping election monitors on the ground. She says it's also important for people to speak up when they see something wrong. But DiNardo says campaigns and political parties do play an important role in engaging voters.
Even years ago when I ran, it was a natural process. Are you going to be able to come out to vote? And if not, would you like an application? And I think that's important. We're not giving them a ballot. We're giving them the application.
She says it's important that eligible voters have access to absentee ballots. So it's been standard practice for a long time to hand out absentee ballot applications.
We recognize that, not everybody can go out to vote, particularly like in senior housing.
But some state residents also want people like DiNardo, people in leadership positions, to say more about cleaning up elections in Bridgeport.
Where is the state party on all this?
That's Jonathan Wharton, a Connecticut Republican and an associate professor of political science and urban affairs at Southern Connecticut State University.
It's really important, if not critical, that the state party chimes in and they have their own initiatives set in place and they reinforce the way that they see how elections can be managed and what the concerns are in an urban base like Bridgeport. So I think that's a lingering concern that really has not been fully addressed.
So to recap, we've got grassroots activism, federal grand juries, and election reforms, all hoping to chip away at the political dysfunction in Bridgeport. Now, some of these efforts do leave a bad taste in people's mouths, but they also offer up possible paths forward. So where does that leave us? Joe Ganim is still mayor, despite abusing his office and going to prison for it, and despite the allegations of election misconduct against a handful of his supporters.
To be clear, Ganim hasn't personally been accused of breaking the law again, or doing the kinds of things that landed him in prison 2 decades ago. But here's the thing. Ganim doesn't exist in a vacuum. The state has had numerous leaders convicted of corruption, including Ganim, and Connecticut's former governor, John Rowland. And in some ways, Ganim's tenure in office has parallels with another Bridgeport mayor, John Mandanisi.
During the 70s and 80s, Mandanisi also ran up against the FBI and a federal jury on allegations of corruption. He was never convicted. But more than a dozen members of his administration were indicted on corruption charges. Bria and I spent hours in the Bridgeport archives poring over newspaper coverage from the Ganim and Mandanisi eras, and at some point, they started to feel like they ran together. Both inherited a city with terrible economic conditions. A 1975 article about the race for Bridgeport's next mayor opened with wanted, volunteers for captain of the Titanic.
And both, despite their personal flaws and political enemies, were beloved by many people in Bridgeport. People around them said they're charismatic and skilled at retail politics. Ganim, years later, continues to win elections. And when Mandanisi died in the 80s, mourners flooded the streets of Bridgeport.
I did it my way.
That was Mandanisi's campaign song. And it sort of works for both politicians and our understanding that maybe there will always be leaders, particularly when times are tough, that will seek power their way. Ganim is part of a system that enables those kinds of politics.
After 1 conviction, 2 recent election lawsuits, and 7 terms as mayor, he's still standing. Here's voter Diana Zapata, who we spoke to at the polls.
Yes, he has fault, but hey, everybody deserves a second chance. And that's the reason why I support him, because I am human. And not everyone that had either a bad past or have done or caused or whatever, people do better.
After that ballot box stuffing video came out last fall, Bridgeport had to redo its primary and general elections. And Ganim came out on top all 4 times.
But because of that video, Bridgeport's elections will receive a lot more scrutiny going forward. Here's Jonathan Wharton, the political science professor.
We're going to see now more involvement come from the state, where the monitor is going to be playing an active role more than the past over several days. Are we going to see, additional grievances filed? Are we going to see more attorney involvement? It'll probably be all the above.
Back in 2015, Ganim apologized for hurting the city. He owned up to his mistakes and said he was sorry. And in that speech, Ganim said he was always hopeful about Bridgeport's future.
Today, I stand before you as a better, stronger, wiser, humbler person.
He said he would never allow those things to happen again. And he said, as much as his speech was about apologizing for the past, he wanted to celebrate the future.
It's about the future and the hope of better days, and I think a better city. If we want it to be, it's also about giving our city, in many ways, a second chance.
When we started reporting for this podcast, we wanted to better understand the history of political dysfunction in Bridgeport. And we watched as the state and country watched that exact dysfunction playing out in real time. The New York Times called the 2023 mayoral election perhaps the most confusing in the country. It sure felt like it. The most confusing election in the country isn't what you'd hope for in a healthy, functioning democracy. As we peeled back the layers of a decades-old corruption scandal, modern political patronage, and a very real history of election misconduct, we found deep feelings of distrust in Bridgeport's leaders. We'd understand if you listened to this podcast and came away feeling a little cynical.
But here's what we also found. People. Complicated people. People giving their all to an existing political structure, and people fighting every day to change it. People who care deeply about universal issues, like violence and education and healthcare and poverty. People who believed, fundamentally, that the city they love, and they really do love it, could be better. People like Ann Cody, Lamont Daniels, Jennifer Perez, and Willie Medina.
I have hope, because hope springs eternal, that my vote and the vote of all the other residents is actually going to matter.
Let's go Bridgeport, let's go change.
it's a good community. There's great people out there who are honest, hardworking people who want fair elections, who are just have some apathy right now.
And I've experienced some of the good and the bad, but I think that the good outweighs the bad, and I think we're ready to have this cloud leave our city permanently.
As they say, every cloud has a silver lining. And in Bridgeport, the people are that silver lining. They're opening new businesses, they're painting murals, they're starting film festivals, they're doing so many things to reclaim the narrative of their city. Bridgeport is more than its politics. And every day, residents are working to shake that perception. This episode was reported and produced by me, Kate Seltzer, and by Jim Huddadine. Jim Huddadine is also our investigative editor. Meg Dalton and Cassandra Bassler are our editors. The investigative team also includes Bria Lloyd and Ashad Hajela. Fact-checking by Danya Suleiman. Sound design and mixing by Adrienne Lilly. Music in this episode from APM.
Additional editing help from Lily Tyson, Erica McIntosh, Robin Dwayne Aitken, Vanessa De La Torre, Lucy Napathanchel, Katie Tolarski, and Eric Austin.
Archival news reporting by WFSB.
Legal review by Hinckley Allen. Vanessa De La Torre is our Chief Content Officer. A big shout out to our social, visuals, digital, and marketing teams for their support. And a special thanks to Walter Smith Randolph.
To learn more about the podcast, visit ctpublic.org/BPT. I'm Kate Seltzer.
And I'm Bria Lloyd. And Absentia is a production of Connecticut Public.